Hi! Welcome back to Who Shot Guybrush Threepwood, meditations on the life, death, and rebirth of the adventure game. Adventure game. Adventure game? Adventure game. What kind of name is that? Adventure game. It's an atypical way of categorizing video games, I'll say that much. We usually give game genres titles like first-person shooter, real-time strategy, turn-based role-playing game, real nuts and bolts kind of stuff. Meanwhile, adventure seemingly belongs on a turnstile of airport paperbacks in between mystery and romance. When they slap that word on a game box, what is it supposed to communicate to us? It's not even particularly accurate. I can see how a horror game is horrifying, how a fighting game earns its title, but how is exploring an empty suburban house an adventure? And why is exploring a universe not? When I started this series, I offered up the rough-and-tumble definition of adventure game, puzzles and plots, and said maybe we'll come up with a better definition later. That was 4 years ago. Sorry about that. I know it's late, and a lot has changed since then, but I did promise. So we're gonna do it. Today's question is, what makes an adventure game an adventure game? This is a tricky sort of question to ask because upon asking, we might stumble down the highway to what makes an adventure novel, what makes a rail shooter not an RPG, and that road inevitably terminates with, what even is genre? The answer to which is a bit beyond the scope of a YouTube video essay. Or it would be on anyone else's channel, but this is Innuendo Studios. We'll take the long road. Welcome to Who Shot Guybrush Threepwood, a philosophical interrogation into the meaning of genre in and beyond the gaming idiom, with the adventure game as our guide. The historical perspective reveals only so much, but it is a place to begin. If you don't know the story, in 1976, Will Crowther released Colossal Cave Adventure, a text-based story game set in an underground land loosely based on a real Kentucky cave system. The game would describe what was happening in a given section, and players would type simple commands to perform tasks and progress through the narrative, usually a verb linked to a noun, like a book that writes itself and responds to directives. This was the first of what we've come to call interactive fiction. Crowther's game, often abbreviated simply Adventure, inspired a number of similar titles, most famously Zork, which was called an adventure game, for the same reason Rise of the Triad was called a Doom clone, because they were more or less mechanically identical to the games they descended from. This is where the genre gets its title. But the evolution from then to now has been oddly zero-sum. Every addition, a subtraction. As more and more adventure games came out, the text descriptions were eventually replaced with graphics, still images replaced with animations, the parser replaced with a verb list, and the keyboard itself replaced with a mouse. In the progression of Zork to Mystery House to King's Quest to Maniac Mansion to Monkey Island, you can see how each link in the chain is a logical progression from the game preceding and into the one that follows, but you end up with a genre that began comprised entirely of words on a screen, but that by the early 90s typically possessed, but did not strictly speaking require, language. There is no question that wordless experiences like Dropsy and Cairo are direct descendants of Monkey Island and Myst, that they are therefore in the same genre as Wishbringer, despite zero obvious mechanical overlap, is, for a medium that typically names its genres after their mechanics, weird. Also, for anyone confused, Nintendo used to delineate games that explored a continuous world from games that leapt across a series of discrete levels by calling the latter platformers and the former adventures. And an earlier game in that model was the Atari game Adventure, which was itself a graphical adaptation of the Crowther original. So what 90s kids think of when they hear a game in the style of Adventure depends on whether they played on computer or console, but that lineage eventually embraced the even fuzzier action adventure and is not what we're here to discuss. So the connection between the genre's beginnings and its current incarnation is less mechanical than philosophical, spiritual, even. Something connects this to this, and we're here to pin down what. Now you may be readying to say, Ian, it's clear the determinant of what is or isn't an adventure game is pure association and there is no underlying logic. You don't need to think this hard about everything, which You must be new here. I would counter that as soon as a genre has a name, people will, not entirely on purpose, start placing parameters around what they consider part of that genre. Even if it is just association, there is some method to which associations matter and which ones don't. So, shush. I'm trying to have a conversation. Another one-word genre named after a philosophical connection to a single game is the roguelike, christened after 1980's Rogue. And in 2008, members of the International Roguelike Development Conference in Berlin set about trying to define the genre. And I promise I'm not just going to summarize that one episode of Game Maker's Toolkit. Attendees began with a corpus of 5 games that, despite not yet having an agreed-upon definition, were, unequivocally, roguelikes, an attitude roughly analogous with the Supreme Court's classification of pornography. Even if I can't define it, I know it when I see it. And from these 5 games, they attempted to deduce what makes a roguelike. So perhaps we can follow their example. We'll take a corpus of 5 games and see what they have in common. How about The Secret of Monkey Island, Gabriel Knight Sins of the Fathers, Myst, Beneath a Steel Sky, and Trinity? All 5 visually and mechanically dissimilar, 3 third-person and 2-dimensional, 1 first-person and 3-dimensional, and 1 second-person and made of text. No dimensional? Yet no one would dispute they're all adventure games. So, okay, we can see a lot of common features. Dialogue trees, inventory, fetch quests. But here's the rub. To define the genre by the first 2 would leave out Myst, and defining it by the third would leave out Gabriel Knight. And honestly, any one of these would exclude Loom, which I think anyone who's played one would look at and say, I know an adventure game when I see one. For the sake of inclusivity, we could go broad, as I did with my puzzles and plots. And while this does include everything on our list, it also unavoidably includes games that provoke the wrong reaction, like Portal. I know a puzzle shooter when I see one, and Inside. I know a puzzle platformer when I see one. Trying to draw a line around everything that is an adventure game while excluding everything that is not is no easy feat. The best adventure game definitions are written in a kind of legalese. Andrew Plotkin and Clara Fernandez-Vara have both tackled this, I would say, quite well, with a lot of qualifications and a number of additional paragraphs that specify what counts as unique results and object manipulation. It takes a lot of words, and no disrespect, I certainly can't have an opinion in fewer than 20 minutes anymore, but I can't help thinking we could go about this a different way. What the Berliners cooked up in 2008 was, instead of a lengthily worded definition, a list of high and low value factors a game may have. The absence of any one was not disqualifying, but the more it could lay claim to, the more a game was rogue-like. These were features that could exist in any game, in any genre, but when they clustered together, the Berliners drew a circle around them and said, the roguelike is somewhere in here. A central idea here is that the borders are porous. If we apply this thinking to the adventure game, we could say that Inside and Portal are not lacking in adventure-ish gameplay. They simply have too low a concentration of it to be recognizable as one. This is genre not as a binary, but as a pattern of behavior. So, to unpack that a little, I'm going to use an allegory. But before I do, I want you to know, I'm sorry. In 2014, professor and lecturer Dr. Mariana Ricci, as a thought experiment demonstrating the Socratic method, hypothesized a conversation between Socrates and Euthyphro, in which Socrates posed the internet's second favorite argument, is a hot dog a sandwich? I'm so sorry. We're doing sandwich discourse. Ricci imagined Socrates asking Euthyphro to define sandwich, and sparking the dialectic in which Euthyphro offers up increasingly specific definitions of sandwich, and Socrates challenges each one with something non-sandwich that would necessarily fall under that definition. Is a hot dog a sandwich? Is a taco a sandwich? Are 3 slices of bread a sandwich? Now in this scenario, Socrates is, as was his wont, being a bit of a tool. Euthyphro does all the work of coming up with these long legalistic definitions, and with one single exception, Socrates sends him back to square one. But Socrates is making a point, or rather, Ricci is. Can we really claim to know what a sandwich is if we can't explain why it's a sandwich? Perhaps we should admit the limits of our own common sense. Perhaps we should embrace the inherent uncertainty of knowledge. Or perhaps we could tell Socrates to stop having flame wars and think like a Berliner. Does sandwich versus non-sandwich have to be a binary? Could we not argue that a sandwich has many qualities, few of them critical, but a plurality of which will increase a thing's sandwichness? Are there many pathways to sandwichness, a certain platonic ideal of sandwich that can be approximated in a variety of ways? What if the experience of sandwich can be evoked so strongly by one factor that some leeway is granted with others? And what if many factors are present, but none quite so strongly that it generates the expected sensation? Well, the question then becomes, which factors contribute most to that experience, and how much slack can be granted on one axis, provided another is rock solid? A sandwich is not merely an object, it's a set of flavors, textures, sensations, and cultural signifiers. We so often try to define objects by the properties they possess, and not by the experience they generate. But a sandwich does not exist solely on the plate, but also in the mouth, and in the mind. So let us entertain that saying a chip buddy feels like a sandwich and a hot dog does not is as valid as anything else. In 2012, the internet was besotted with its fourth favorite argument: is Dear Esther a video game? You know, like really. Is it though? And David Shute, designer of Small Worlds, a micro-exploration platformer and maybe adventure game, countered this question with a blog post: are video games games? Shute invoked the philosophical concept of qualia. A qual is a characteristic, an irreducible somethingness that a thing possesses. Very hard to put into words, but once experienced will be instantly recognizable when it is experienced again. Qualia are what allow us to, having seen a car, recognize other cars when we see them, and not confuse them with motorcycles, even if we haven't sat down to write a definition for either. And if we did try to formalize the distinction, say, a car has 4 wheels and fully encloses the operator, our Socrates might pop in to say, well then, friend, is this not a car? Is this not a car? To which Shute, and by extension we, might comment that Socrates is once again being a buttface. If I remove the wheels from a car, then it no longer provides the basic fundamental functionality I'd expect a car to have. But it's still a car. Its carness requires some qualification, admittedly, but it hasn't suddenly become something else. And we don't need to define a new category of objects for things that are just like cars, but can't be driven. What's special about qualia is that they're highly subjective and yet shockingly universal. We wouldn't be able to function if we needed a 3-paragraph definition just to know what a car is. Get anywhere on Route 128? Forget about it. These arguments over the definition of game or sandwich ask us to pretend we don't recognize things we recognize. Socrates' whole rhetorical strategy is pretending to believe pizza is a sandwich. And anyone who doesn't care about gatekeeping their hobby will see Dear Esther among other first-person 3D computer experiences and know instantly that they fall under the same umbrella. Certainly putative not-game Dear Esther has more in common with yes-game Half-Life 2 than Half-Life 2 has with, for instance, chess. Shute goes on, to me, it's obvious that Dear Esther is a video game, because it feels like one. When I play Dear Esther, I'm experiencing and inhabiting that world in exactly the same way I experience and inhabit any video game world. It has an essential video gameness that's clearly distinct from the way I experience an architectural simulation, or a DVD menu, or a PowerPoint slideshow. I might struggle to explain the distinction between them in words, or construct a diagram that neatly places everything in strict categories, but the distinction is nonetheless clear. This is the move from plate to mouth. If you're trying to define the adventure game and you're talking only about the game's features and not what it feels like to inhabit those worlds, you're not actually talking about genre. So if we want to locate this adventure experience, and we agree that it can theoretically appear in any game, we might look for it where it stands out from the background, in an action game. Let's see if we can find it in Uncharted. It's a good touchstone, because we know the adventure experience is about narrative gameplay, and Uncharted has always been about recreating Indiana Jones as a video game, converting narrative into gameplay. When attempting such a conversion, a central question designers will ask is, what are my verbs? Nathan Drake's gotta do something in these games, so we look to the source material for inspiration. A good video game verb is something simple and repeatable, easy to map to a face button. And Indiana Jones has them in abundance. Indy punches, we can put in punches. Indy runs, we can put in running. Indy jumps, we can jump. Indy climbs, we can climb. Indy swings, we can swing. Indy takes cover, we got cover mechanics for days. All simple and repeatable. You can get a lot of gameplay out of those. But that's not all there is to Indiana Jones, is it? There's also, well, colonialism, but turns out that translates pretty easily. But Indy rather famously solves ancient riddles, and he cleverly escapes certain death, and has tense conversations with estranged family members, and finds dramatic solutions to unsolvable problems. And none of these are simple and repeatable. In fact, they're dramatic because they're unique, and because they're complex. And Uncharted renders all of these sequences the same way, with a button remap. When Drake talks to his long-lost brother, or discovers the existence of Libertalia, his jumpy-shooty buttons turn into a completely different set of mechanics for just this sequence, and then go back to being jumpy-shooty buttons. Where typically you have a narrative tailored around a certain set of core mechanics, here the mechanics tailor themselves around a certain narrative experience. And each of these narrative experiences tailors the mechanics differently. What if we made a whole genre out of that? Adventure games are the haven for all the misfit bits of drama that don't convert easily into traditional gameplay. In the old games, you'd never ask, what are my verbs, because they were at the bottom of the screen. Or if it were a parser game, your list of possible verbs was as broad as the English language. If a designer wanted to, they could, technically, have every valid action in the game involve its own unique verb. So rather than specialized, the mechanical space of possibility is broad. The verbs open-ended, often to the point of being vague, meaning different things in different contexts. The idea is to have a space open enough that any dramatic beat can be rendered in gameplay, provided you can express it by connecting a verb to a noun. Push statue. Talk to Henry. Use sword on rope. Nathan Drake shoots upwards of 2,000 people in a single game, but he's not going to solve 2,000 ancient riddles, and he probably shouldn't, because what makes ancient riddles interesting is that you're not going to come across very many in your life. They are momentous. So maybe the mechanics should be as unique as the event itself. And maybe discovering what this event's unique mechanics are is part of the gameplay. The best word we have for these moments is puzzle. Adventure games aren't named after their core mechanics because, by design, adventure games don't have core mechanics. Puzzles have mechanics. Learning them is the game, and they can be whatever the designer imagines. Which is not to say they will be. Many games over-rely on inventory and jumping peg puzzles, because even in a near-infinite space of possibility, there are paths of least resistance. But many adventure games have neither, and many are built entirely around single mechanics that don't appear in any other adventure games. A puzzle isn't simply a thing you do to be rewarded with more plot. It is an answer to the game's repeated question, what happens next? It was literally the prompt in many versions of Colossal Cave. How did the stranger find the linking book that took them to Channelwood? How did Robert Cath defuse the bomb on the Orient Express? How did Manny Calavera find the florist in the sewers of El Marrow? It is story told through gameplay, and gameplay built for telling stories. So I would amend my prior definition, adventure games are about puzzles and plots, to adventure games are about puzzles as plots. Any more than that, if you still want to understand the adventure game experience, you will probably just have to play one. I say start with Full Throttle. Rick Altman argues we too often define genres by their building blocks and not what gets built out of them. If you want to write science fiction, you have many components to work with. Spaceships, time travel, nanomachines. You can make sci-fi out of that. But What if you take the component parts of science fiction and build a breakup story or a tragicomic war novel? Is it still sci-fi? Let me put it to you this way. If somebody asks you to recommend some good science fiction to them and you say, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, how likely are they to say, yes, this is exactly what I was asking for? Blade Runner is what happens when you use science fiction to build film noir. Dark City is what happens when you use film noir to build science fiction. So what defines a genre? The bricks or the blueprint? Any meaningful discussion should account for both. See, adventure games are mechanically agnostic, all blueprint. You can build one out of almost anything. And that's why we had to take the long road, because the ways we're used to thinking about genre were insufficient. So from these few steps back, the adventure game isn't even that weird. Game genres are usually named after their mechanics, and a small handful are left in the cold by that convention. This would have been a much shorter conversation if not for the fact that video games run on this completely different set of rules from every other medium that has genres. But do they, though? What actually is genre for? Well, Samuel R. Delany, yes, I'm still talking about this guy, describes genre not as a list of ingredients, but as a recipe. Imagine for me you've just read the following 4 words. The horizon does flips. If this is just a, for a lack of a better word, normal story, not genre fiction, that's gotta be some kind of metaphor, right? Maybe for the protagonist feeling dizzy or for the moment the drugs start to hit. Whatever it is, it can't be literal because the earth and sky do not change places in naturalistic fiction. But they can in fantasy. Certainly stranger things have happened. And they can in science fiction, but by a different set of rules. Now, there's a why. It's got to be something to do with gravity or the warping of space. Even if the story never explains it, it has to convince you within a certain suspension of disbelief that such a thing is happening in our universe. Whatever it is, it's not magic. These 4 words can mean many things, and genre informs you which of the many possible interpretations is the correct one. And for what it's worth, they're Bare Naked Ladies lyrics about being in a car crash.
While out my window, the horizon does flips.
The label science fiction isn't there to tell you whether a story has ray guns. It's there so you know which mechanism of interpretation you should employ. Genre is not what's in the book, it's how you read the book. The opening chapters of a mystery novel may be, by the standards of any other genre, excruciatingly dull. A lot of descriptions of scenery, and a dozen characters introducing themselves. But because you know it's a mystery, these first pages are suffused with portent, even dread, because you know someone's probably gonna die. And some of these mundane details are just that, but some of them are clues as to who committed a crime that hasn't even happened yet. You are alert where you would otherwise be bored. And you know to watch for these clues because you know you're reading a mystery. In other words, because you know the genre's mechanics. Genre dictates the attention to be paid. Words, sounds, images, they don't mean things on their own. They have to be interpreted. If part of genre is the audience's experience, it's an experience the audience co-creates, and it needs clues as to how. I've said before that all communication is collaborative. Here's what results from that. All art is interactive. Video games are not unique in this regard. They're simply the far end of a spectrum. But if the purpose of genre is to calibrate the audience into creating the correct experience, perhaps it makes sense that the most interactive medium would name its genres after what the player is doing. So the label adventure game is, to the best of its ability, doing the same thing as adventure novel and as first-person shooter, if perhaps a bit inelegantly. There may be better ways to straddle these lines, but a shorthand reference to an old text game gets the job done. And that's the end of our journey. I really hope we can do this again sometime, and preferably not in another 4 years. But we'll see how things shake out. Regardless, I'm glad you were with me, and I'll see you in the next one. It's been an adventure.